That usually is the trickiest part. This is where people either shoot themselves in the eye with a spring or lose something. I almost lost my firing pin stop when I took it apart. So this little spring and plunger assembly, this blocks your firing pin from being able to go forward if the trigger isn't pulled. So it's a safety feature. You want to make sure you definitely get this in right and working. So it sits in this little round hole in the bottom of the slide here. If you push it in there, it should move freely. It should try to spring back out at you a little bit, but it shouldn't take a whole lot of pressure to hold it in. So if you hold it in and then you grab your extractor, slip that guy in there. When your extractor's sitting in there right, your firing pin stop won't try to come back out. Now if it does, you probably don't have them together right. And it won't take you very long to notice if you don't have it together right when you actually go to fire, but hopefully you'll figure that out before you actually go to the range. When you have those two parts in there, and you've cleaned out whatever you want to clean out there, your firing pin assembly, I wouldn't normally take this apart unless you've really been shooting it a lot, but that could kind of be covered under the frame, pretty much complete disassembly. You can hose it out with powder blaster if you've got a lot of gunk in there. And as far as the rem oil is concerned, now if you hose out your slide with that powder blaster, it's going to evaporate and pull off all the oil. And you don't want it to be completely, oilless. So if you take a spray can of rem oil and lightly hose over it, and then just take a rag and wipe all the excess off, and then just take a Q-tip and run it into your, your firing pin channel, and in your extractor groove before you put this parts back in. That'll give it a little bit of lubrication, keep any rust from forming, but it isn't gonna, be dripping. When you got a lot of excess oil in there, lint fuzzies and powder residue get stuck in it, and it turns into a slime real quick. So you definitely want to avoid over-oiling. Now there's a couple key spots you can oil. When you put that extractor and that firing pin stop back in, a drop of oil in either of those holes will give it just enough that it isn't going to bind up, but not enough that it's going to collect grime. Same with your firing pin. Now actually the firing pin, I really don't like to have any oil on it. I like it to be oiled enough that it ain't going to rust and get nasty, but it really does not need to be slimed up at all either. I usually like to use a little dropper of rem oil in it. You can put 1 or 2 drops in your spring assembly, maybe a drop up here at the firing pin nose itself. You don't really need to worry about oiling the sleeve or anything like that, just enough to keep it from binding up. And when you've had everything cleaned out and you got it very lightly oiled, you can begin to drop parts back in here. You can drop your firing pin assembly back in there. And it should, that sleeve is actually compressing the spring. When you stick this little end cap on there, it actually latches into a little groove in your plate here in the back. So it keeps the plate from sliding off and it keeps your firing pin oriented. And let's see if I can find it here. Where did I sit? Oh, right here. This is your extractor plunger. Now when you put this back in, it can be kind of confusing. If you put this in backward, A, your gun isn't going to work, and B, even if it does manage to work, you're really going to take a high wear on your parts. Glock says metal to metal and plastic to plastic. This little detent on the end here is plastic, and this longer rod on the end here is steel. This end cap is plastic. If you put it in backward, you're going to have this plastic cap running down here and trying to push on your extractor, and it's going to bind up, and then your metal rod is going to be digging into your plastic plate in the back here, and you definitely don't want that. So make sure you drop this rod end, metal end first, at which point you're ready to slide this back plate on. Now this can be a little bit tricky. This is where people either shoot themselves in the eye with a spring or they manage to lose a part. If you get your little, and you'll notice in your Glock in the back of the slide there's a slight cutout for your plate to slide into. If you start your plate, you start your plate sliding in there to the point where it's touching up against the back of your sleeve. If you get a nylon punch or something that isn't going to damage plastic if you slip too bad, and push down on that sleeve, it'll allow you to slide that plate up farther, and it'll capture that whole firing pin housing there. And the only thing you have to push down there at the end is that extractor assembly. So if you have either your Glock tool or a flat-ended screwdriver, something that isn't going to gouge the steel, you don't want anything with a sharp point, it'll allow you to compress this. So if you compress that down in there, it will allow you to, with a little bit of wiggling normally, slide that plate up just a little bit farther, and then it'll snap into place. So you've got everything pinned in there. Now, you can tell if this is working for the most part, even before you get it back together. Your firing pin, if you push back on it, should go back smoothly and it should snap forward without an issue. Your firing pin stop here, you should be able to push it in and it should come back out smoothly. It shouldn't try to fly out. If it flies out, you didn't get your extractor in here correctly. Your extractor, if you push on it a little bit, it should spring out just enough to give you clearance there, and that'll let you know that you got it back together right. And then as far as your barrel assembly is concerned, barrel simple, not complicated. You just slide it in there, make sure it's sitting in its recess here in the slide. Now, depending on which model Glock you have and which generation, you're going to have a different style guide rod. This, I think, is a generation 2. This one is not a dual spring, so if you have a dual spring, it's going to look differently. But on mine, the large end goes toward the barrel, or the breech end, and this small end goes toward the muzzle. And that small end sits in this cutout here in the slide. And you want to make sure you get it in there, because if you don't, it'll try to slip out. So if you sit it in there, you've also got a half circle cutout here in your barrel, which is where this round end sits. If you slide that front end in, and it can be a bit tricky, and get your back end sitting in there. At that point, you can slide the gun together without a trouble. If it's sitting up here too high, it's not going to let you put it together. If it's sitting down too low, you're probably going to have it bind up on you. At which point, you can take your slide, and this is also another problem. If you're not paying attention to where your rails are, there is a chance that you will get your slide latched onto the front two and actually back over one of them, kind of like that kind of deal going on there. And you can get it apart, it's just a real pain. So just be careful when you're sliding it back on that you actually get it in the rails. And on another note, if you do manage to wipe off your frame and you clean out your rails and stuff, it's also a good idea to go back on these there's 4 inserts, 2 in the rear and 2 in the front. They're both steel inserts into your polymer frame. You can either apply a drop of REM oil to them, 1 or 2 to each, or you can use, there's a couple different companies that make a silver or gold grade anti-seize you can put on there. I wouldn't recommend slathering it in grease, because grease will collect, of course, every lint fuzzy and piece of dirt you've got. So if you put a single drop or 2 on there, on each one, it'll give you just enough lubrication that everything's going to work smoothly, but it's not going to be an absolute sludge fest when you go to clean it next time. So make sure you get your 4 rail inserts oiled. And as far as, actually I should mention, before you put the slide back on, as far as oiling any of your slide points, you can possibly put another drop of oil in your firing pin stop area, just to make sure there's, it's springing back and forth freely. I wouldn't put too much in your firing pin channel. That can be really bad. If you get that gunked up, it won't always go off. And as far as your barrel, Glock actually has a couple spots that they'd recommend oiling. If you put a drop of oil up on the front of your barrel hood here where it locks into your slide, and I don't know if you can see this or not on my gun, but you can see the wear marks up on the front of this barrel where it's actually locking into the slide. So if you put a drop or two on the front of that barrel, that'll give you all the lubrication you need. You can also throw one down here where it locks into the frame if you would like. And it's not really necessary. You could put the tiniest little bit right here on the barrel hood. Anywhere where you see wear marks, you could pretty much apply a single or 1 or 2 drops of oil to it. Remember, if you over oil it, you're just going to get a lot of sludge going on. So once you've oiled it, drop or 2 only, all you have to do is slide your slide back on. And you can tell if it's on there right, if it does not try to pull off the front at all. Remember how I showed in the beginning, when you pull down these little pieces here, if it tries to pull off the front, it's not latched in there properly. So when you're at this point, everything should work smoothly. Your slide should pull to the rear and fly forward without a hassle. In addition, if you pull the slide to the rear, once again making sure it's not loaded if you've have any ammunition near you, and you point it in a safe direction and pull the trigger, and you shake it. And you probably can't hear it on here, but you should hear the slightest little tink-tink. It's actually your firing pin being able to move forward just a little bit and slide in its recess. And holding that trigger in, if you pull the slide to the rear and let it go forward, your trigger should also snap back into the forward position. It should not stay at the rear. So those are just a couple quick function tests to make sure that you got it back together correctly. And that's about all there is to it. Really, I just clean out the slide assembly for the most part. If you've been shooting a lot, then you could move on to the frame, but that's a whole nother ball game. And like I said, there's a couple different generations, so your Glock may not look exactly like mine, but it is basically the same thing. So if you have any questions, feel free to stop by and talk to us. We're here Tuesday through Friday, 10 in the morning to late in the evening, and on Saturday we're here from 9 to 4. Sundays and Mondays we are closed, however. So look forward to seeing you then. Bye.